Paul McCartney and George Harrison once stood side by side as two members of the most famous band in the world. But behind the music, something had changed. George no longer wanted to remain in Paul's shadow, while Paul struggled to understand the growing distance between them. Their friendship had survived fame, pressure, and the end of the Beatles. Yet old frustrations were still there. And when George finally pushed back, their relationship entered one of its most painful chapters. For years, George Harrison was known as the Quiet Beatle. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were usually seen as the band's main songwriters. They wrote the songs that filled the charts, while George often stood beside them with his guitar. But George was changing. By the later years of the Beatles, he was no longer the young musician who simply accepted his place in the group. He had become a serious songwriter with his own ideas, his own sound, and a growing collection of songs. The problem was that the Beatles had a system. Paul and John had built much of the band's creative identity together. Their partnership was powerful, but it could also leave George feeling pushed aside. That frustration did not appear overnight. George had been writing songs for years. Some of his early Beatles songs became classics, including While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Here Comes the Sun, and Something. But even when George would do strong material, he often had to fight for space on Beatles albums. By the time the band reached its final years, George had a much bigger creative voice than before. He also had something the younger George had not possessed: confidence. He knew what he could do, and he knew that some of the songs were good enough to stand beside those written by Paul and John. That created tension. Paul was deeply involved in the band's recordings. He often pushed musicians to get performances exactly the way he imagined them. From Paul's point of view, that attention helped the band produce great music. But from George's point of view, it could feel like too much control. The two men were very different. Paul was often energetic, focused, and determined to keep working. George was becoming more interested in independence, spirituality, and finding his own musical identity. Those differences became harder to ignore during the recording of the Beatles, often called the White Album, and later during the Get Back sessions. The studio was no longer always a place of excitement. Sometimes it became a place where old frustrations came to the surface. George wanted his ideas respected. Paul wanted the songs to be as strong as possible. Both wanted the Beatles to succeed. But they did not always agree on how to get there. And behind those disagreements was something deeper. George had spent years watching John and Paul receive most of the attention. Now he was beginning to wonder why he should continue accepting a smaller role. The Quiet Beatle was finding his voice. And once George began speaking more openly about what he wanted, the relationship between him and Paul became much harder to hide. The tension was about to become impossible for the band to ignore. By the time the Beatles entered their final years, the group was carrying more pressure than the public could see. They were no longer simply four young musicians playing songs together. They were one of the biggest bands in history, and every decision seemed to matter. Paul McCartney often took a strong leadership role in the studio. After manager Brian Epstein died in 1967, the band lost a person who had helped keep many of their problems organized. Without him, the four Beatles had to deal with more of the business and creative pressure themselves. Paul became increasingly focused on keeping the group moving. That drive helped create some of the Beatles' greatest music. But it also created friction. George did not always want to follow Paul's direction. He had developed into a confident songwriter, and he wanted more room for his own material. The number of songs George was writing was growing, yet Beatles albums could only contain so many tracks. That created a difficult situation. George had songs ready to record, but Paul and John still controlled much of the band's songwriting space. The problem was not simply about one song. It was about recognition. George had spent years learning from John and Paul, but now he had become an accomplished musician in his own right. And there was another important difference. George had discovered a different world outside the Beatles. His interest in Indian music and spirituality had changed the way he looked at life. He was less interested in the constant pressure surrounding the band. Paul, meanwhile, remained deeply focused on the music. Neither approach was necessarily wrong, but they were moving in different directions. During the recording of the White Album in 1968, tensions inside the group became more visible. The sessions were demanding, and disagreements between the members became more common. George eventually left the group temporarily during the Get Back sessions in January 1969. His departure showed just how serious the problems had become. The band later continued, and George returned. But returning did not mean that the underlying issues had disappeared. If anything, George had learned something important. He did not have to accept every decision simply because Paul or John wanted it. He had his own voice. He had his own songs. And he had already started thinking about what life might look like outside the Beatles. That change was important because George was no longer fighting only for a place inside the band. He was preparing for a life after it. When Abbey Road was recorded later in 1969, George's songwriting had become impossible to overlook. Something, and Here Comes the Sun, showed just how far he had come. The old balance inside the group was changing. Paul could still push hard. John could still dominate attention. But George was no longer willing to quietly accept whatever space was left for him. And as the Beatles moved closer to their final days, the tension between Paul and George would become even more personal. Because sometimes the hardest conflicts are not caused by strangers. They happen between people who once understood each other extremely well. The tension between Paul McCartney and George Harrison was not simply about two people who disliked each other. They had spent years together. They had grown up together. They had traveled the world together. And they had helped create music that changed popular culture. That history made their disagreements more complicated. Paul often wanted the Beatles to keep moving. When he heard a part that he thought could be stronger, he was willing to speak up. He could be demanding in the studio, especially when he believed the song needed more work. For George, that could feel very different. George wanted his musical ideas to be taken seriously. He was no longer simply the young guitarist learning from Paul and John. He had developed into a songwriter with a distinct voice. But there were still moments when Paul would challenge his playing or suggest a different approach. During the Get Back sessions, this tension became especially visible. The Beatles were being filmed while they worked on new material. Because cameras were present, private disagreements that might once have stayed behind closed doors were captured for project. One of the most important moments came when George and Paul argued about George's guitar playing. Paul was trying to explain how he wanted a guitar part played. George did not accept the criticism quietly. Their conversation showed the deeper problem. George wanted Paul to stop treating him like a younger bandmate who needed instructions. He wanted Paul to trust him. Not long after that tension, George left the group temporarily. His decision shocked the others. The Beatles were still one of the most successful bands in the world. But inside the studio, their relationships were under enormous pressure. George's departure was a clear sign that something had gone too far. Eventually, the band persuaded him to return, but the atmosphere had changed. George was now more independent. He had already proven that he could write powerful songs, and he knew there was a world beyond the Beatles. His confidence continued to grow. Paul also had his own frustrations. He believed strongly in the band's music and wanted to protect its quality. From his perspective, pushing George could sometimes be part of getting the best result. That difference in perspective explains why their relationship became so difficult. Paul could see his actions as dedication. George could experience those same actions as control. Neither man necessarily saw the situation in exactly the same way. And this is where the idea of resentment becomes important. George had spent years watching John and Paul receive the largest share of attention. Now he had songs that could stand on their own. Something became one of the most respected Beatles songs, while Here Comes the Sun became another major favorite. George was finally getting the recognition he had wanted. But recognition also came with a new question. If he could succeed as a songwriter outside the Beatles, why should he continue accepting a smaller role inside the group? That question became even more important as the band approached its final recordings. The Beatles were still capable of making incredible music, but the personal relationships were becoming harder to repair. George and Paul could still work together. They could still laugh together. They could still create something special. Yet underneath those moments was a history of disagreements that neither man could simply erase. And when the Beatles finally broke apart, the distance between them became even clearer. For George, freedom was finally possible. For Paul, Losing the Beatles meant losing the group he had fought so hard to keep together. Their friendship had survived many years, but the breakup would test it in a completely different way. The tension between Paul and George did not end when George left the Get Back sessions. George eventually returned, and the Beatles continued working. But something had changed. George had shown that he was willing to walk away. That mattered. He was no longer afraid of losing his place in the band. By this point, George had also built a strong identity outside the Beatles. His interest in spirituality had grown. His songwriting had become stronger, and his confidence was different from the early days. Then came Abbey Road. The album showed just how much George had developed. Something became one of his most important songs. Here Comes the Sun became another major success. Suddenly, the man who had once been treated as a third songwriter was producing songs that stood beside the work of Paul and John. For George, this must have been important. He no longer needed anyone to tell him that he could write. The music had already answered that question, but the Beatles were still falling apart. John had privately decided to leave the group in 1969, although the announcement was delayed. Paul was deeply unhappy with the direction of events and later became the first Beatle to publicly announce his own departure in 1970. The breakup was painful for all four members. For George, it also created an opportunity. He suddenly had a large collection of songs that had never received enough space on Beatles albums. Those songs became the foundation of All Things Must Pass. The success of that album proved something George had already begun to understand. He could stand alone. Paul, meanwhile, began his solo career with McCartney. Both men were now outside the Beatles. But instead of solving everything, the breakup created another kind of distance. There were legal disagreements, business problems, and arguments about the Beatles' future. Old frustrations did not disappear simply because the band was gone. In some ways, they became easier to see. George had once felt that Paul did not always respect his musical independence. Paul had his own memories of the band's final years and his own feelings about how everything had ended. The two men were no longer forced to sit in the same studio every day. That gave them freedom, but it also meant they could stay apart. Still, their story was not simply one of hatred. That is important. George and Paul had shared too much history for their relationship to become completely meaningless. They had been teenagers together before worldwide fame changed their lives. They had played small clubs before stadiums. They had watched each other grow from young musicians into global stars. Even after the Beatles ended, their paths continued to cross. There were moments when they supported each other's work. There were also moments when old disagreements returned. That was the strange truth about their relationship. They could be frustrated with each other and still care about each other. They could disagree strongly and still respect what the other person had achieved. The resentment was real, but so was the history. And as the years passed, something slowly changed. The anger that had once filled their conversations became less important. Time had a way of putting those Beatles years into perspective. George was building his own life. Paul was building his own career. Both men were moving forward, but neither could completely escape the past. Because no matter how far they traveled, they would always share one extraordinary chapter of their lives. They had been Beatles, and that bond could never be completely broken. After the Beatles ended, George Harrison and Paul McCartney followed very different paths. George focused on his solo music, spiritual interests, and his life away from the constant pressure of the Beatles' years. Paul built his own band, Wings, and returned to the stage. Both found major success, but the friendship between them was no longer the same. The years of arguments had left memories behind. George could still feel frustrated about the way he had sometimes been treated in the Beatles. Paul could still look back at the band's final years with his own version of events. Yet time slowly changed the situation. The two men were no longer young musicians fighting over studio decisions. They were older men who had lived through something almost impossible to explain to anyone outside the band. They had gone from playing together as teenagers to becoming global celebrities. That shared history mattered. There were also moments when the old friendship became visible again. They crossed paths at events, supported each other at times, and remained connected to the wider Beatles family. One of the most meaningful examples came in 1999, when George survived a serious attack at his home. Paul visited George afterward. The moment was a reminder that beneath years of disagreement, there was still a deep connection between the two men. Their relationship was complicated, but it was not empty. Paul and George had experienced things together that very few people could understand. They had known each other before fame. They had watched the world change around them. They had created music that millions of people still loved. And sometimes, shared history can survive even when a friendship changes shape. George also continued to speak about the Beatles' years with a mixture of humor, frustration, and reflection. He did not pretend that everything had been perfect. Neither did Paul. That honesty made their story more human. The public often wanted simple answers. Who was right? Who was wrong? Was Paul too controlling? Was George too resentful? But real relationships are rarely that simple. Paul's strong personality helped drive the Beatles towards some of their greatest work. George's growing independence helped push him toward becoming a major songwriter in his own right. Both qualities could create conflict. Both could also create great music. By the late 1990s, their relationship had moved far away from the intense arguments of the Beatles' era. But another painful chapter was coming. George's health was becoming a serious concern. His death in November 2001 brought another kind of change. Paul was no longer dealing with George as an old bandmate. He was remembering a friend who had been part of his life since youth. Paul later spoke warmly about George and his musical talent. The years of resentment could not simply erase decades of friendship, and perhaps that is what makes their story so powerful. The bond between Paul and George did not survive because they agreed on everything. It survived because their lives had become connected long before the disagreements began. They had lost a band. They had lost their youth. And eventually, Paul lost George. But the memories remained. And those memories would become even more important as Paul looked back at the years they spent together. The story of Paul McCartney and George Harrison cannot be reduced to one argument, one disagreement, or one period of resentment. Their relationship was far more complicated. They were friends before they were famous. They were bandmates during the greatest years of the Beatles. They were rivals at times, but they were also people who understood each other in ways few others could. George had spent years trying to step out of Paul's shadow, and eventually he did. His solo career proved that he was much more than the quiet Beatle. His songwriting became one of the strongest parts of the Beatles' legacy, and his music after the band showed that he had his own identity. Paul also continued to build a remarkable career. The two men took different paths, but neither could completely escape the history they shared. George's death in 2001 brought the story into a new perspective. Paul lost someone who had been part of his life since they were young. The old arguments suddenly seemed smaller compared with the loss. That does not mean the resentment was never real. It was. George had genuine frustrations, and Paul had his own reasons for the way he behaved. But relationships can hold two truths at the same time. People can hurt each other and still care. They can disagree and still respect one another. They can grow apart without completely forgetting what once connected them. That may be the real story behind Paul and George. The Beatles gave them fame beyond anything they could have imagined, but the same fame placed enormous pressure on their friendships. Every song became important. Every decision became important. Every disagreement could become part of history. For George, the journey was about finding his own voice. For Paul, it was about keeping the music moving forward. Those goals sometimes collided, but those same differences helped shape the music they created together. Without George pushing for more freedom, some of his greatest songs might never have received the attention they deserved. Without Paul's drive, many Beatles recordings might have taken a very different shape. Their conflict was painful, but their creative partnership was also powerful. And perhaps that is why people still talk about them today. The story is not really about two men who simply hated each other. It is about two young friends who grew up together, became famous together, changed music together, and eventually discovered that growing apart was part of becoming themselves. George wanted to be heard. Paul wanted the band to succeed. Both wanted something important. And sometimes, even people who love the same thing can disagree about how to protect it. If this story changed the way the relationship between Paul and George looks, leave a comment with your thoughts. And if the story was worth hearing, a like and share can help others discover it too. For anyone interested in more stories about the hidden side of music history, subscribing keeps the next story close. In the end, George did not remain in Paul's shadow. He became George Harrison. And Paul did not simply remain the Beatle who wanted control. He became Paul McCartney. Two different paths, one unforgettable history, and a friendship that, despite its difficult moments, was never completely forgotten.